Oh, Nintendo, you tricksters! Last week, when they announced that the Nintendo Entertainment System version of Tetris would be coming to the Nintendo Switch Online today, we thought that was going to be it. But here we have the great Alexey Pajitnov revealing that the December 12th update will also include Tetris DX, one of my personal favorite versions of the 40-year-old puzzle game. Yeah, that's cool news. But are either of these versions worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Zone, Nintendo Power, and more classic magazines to see what the critics thought of these two games when they first came out. Alright folks, get ready to experience a little bit of déjà vu in this puzzling episode of Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew.
And there's another thing, Mikhail, the kids these days.
Aye.
Tetris, schmetris, all the time it's Tetris they want to play. And it's not just in Russia. All over the world it's Tetris. Whatever happened to the unicycle and the ball?
Oh man, I finally got it, man!
It's a changing world.
Although Tetris had been around for a number of years, 1989 was the year when it finally broke into the mainstream. Not only did Tengen release their version in May, but the influential puzzler became a massive hit just 3 months later when it was bundled with the Game Boy. So when Nintendo went to release the game on the Nintendo Entertainment System in November of that year, there was already ample evidence that everybody loved Tetris. This console port was a no-brainer. Now, Tetris on the NES was more or less the same version that Game Boy owners had been playing for months, only now in color with a few additions to the display. Other changes included the ending and the lack of a competitive two-player mode that had been in the two previous versions released that year. In a year when Nintendo was mostly focused on the Game Boy, Tetris ended up being the big holiday release for the 4-year-old console. And now, 35 years later, it's finally on the Nintendo Switch Online. So, when it comes to the reviews, there just aren't that many. Most of the magazines that were reviewing games back in 1989 chose to review the Game Boy version, completely ignoring the NES port. I don't know, perhaps it was a choice to not be redundant since the two versions are largely the same. Or perhaps they were just too busy with their brand new 16-bit systems like the Genesis and the TurboGrafx 16. Either way, prepare to be a little bit disappointed there aren't more and better reviews for this iconic NES game. To give you a taste of what I'm talking about, let's kick things off with Game Zone, who gave Tetris the lowest score of any of the English language magazines. Now, it's worth noting that while the reviews worked on a traditional 5-star system, there actually was a score higher than a 5 out of 5 that they called the Mega Zone, which was reserved for games that were better than perfect. Yeah, it's dumb, just like this review. If you don't know what this one's like, then you should be reading Practical Fish Keeping. The Game Boy Classic makes an appearance on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Ugh, Game Zone is the worst. Look, I mentioned English language magazines because there are actually a number of publications throughout Europe that weighed in on this version of Tetris. For example, German magazine Aktueller Software Markt, or ASM if you're into the whole brevity thing, gave the puzzle game an 8.2 out of 12 and complained about the price and the graphics. French magazine Player One gave it a slightly higher 72%, though they did share ASM's criticism about the color scheme. Back in Germany, Video Games Magazine went all the way up to an 88%, while Power of Play went one tick higher with an 89%. And that brings us to Nintendo Magazine System, which gave the NES version of Tetris the highest score of any of the English language publications. Giving it a 91%, they concluded that this block-based mind teaser is the greatest puzzle game ever written. It looks naff, sounds naff, but play it and you'll be instantly hooked. Look, Tetris may indeed be the greatest puzzle game ever written, but this version averaged a less than stellar 78%. That's down quite a bit from the Game Boy version that most of the magazines chose to review, which earned a strong 91%. To be fair, had magazines like Nintendo Power, Computer and Video Games, and even Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewed this version, they likely would have actually raised the average. But alas, we go in with the reviews that we have, not the reviews we wish were written. No matter what, this is a great addition to the Nintendo Switch Online, and a game that probably should have been included in the Tetris Forever compilation. You really can't go wrong with Tetris.
Und wo spielst du?
Few pack-in games have had more of an impact than Tetris on the Game Boy. Not only did Nintendo help to push the Russian puzzler into the mainstream, but its broad appeal helped to attract a new type of gamer to the popular handheld system. So, when Nintendo decided to launch the Game Boy Color in 1998, you better believe that they had a colorized version of Tetris ready on day one. Well, not a pack-in this time. This new version of Tetris did more than just add reds and blues to the screen. It also added a number of new modes, including one that you could play against the computer. Best of all, this version of Tetris actually saved your high scores, which was a big upgrade from the black and white version. This is still one of my own personal favorite versions of Tetris, so let's just go ahead and see what the critics said back in 1998. While Electronic Gaming Monthly may not have reviewed the Nintendo Entertainment System version of Tetris, they definitely covered Tetris DX on the Game Boy Color. And with a score of 8.6 out of 10, they ended up actually liking it more than the 1989 version that was packed with the Game Boy. Sean called it a great update to Tetris. At some points, the tiny Game Boy Color screen makes things difficult, but that's no fault of the games. The ability to save your progress and pick up right where you left off is simply incredible. Like this game needs any more when it comes to replayability. If you have a Game Boy Color and dig Tetris, you'd be silly not to purchase this game. Crispin ended up liking the game even more. I've always thought that when it comes to pure gameplay and replay value, nothing beats Tetris. And the original Game Boy version has always been my favorite. I mean, come on. You can play the most addictive game ever on the crapper. So of course I'm mucho pleased with this sharp color update. The new play modes are cool, sure, but I really like being able to save high scores. Now, before we talk about the other English language review, I want to take a trip to Germany. That's where Total Magazine gave Tetris DX a 100%. Which is, more or less, the same thing that Fun Generation did when they gave it a 10 out of 10. That said, they did complain about the poor graphics and sound, giving both a 3 out of 10, and they wondered if longtime Tetris fans would even be interested in this update. Anyone who owns the original Tetris can safely stay away. If Tetris is still a foreign word for you, then you should actually be at the game dealer by now. Man, the Germans, they really came through with aggressively high scores for Tetris DX. You know who ended up having the lowest score? Well, as shocking as it may sound, it was actually Nintendo Power that went low, giving it a 7.2 out of 10. Instead of reviewing the game, Andy gave us a glimpse into his diet. Tetris is to Game Boy as peanut butter is to banana. A perfect match. Scott agreed, but with one big caveat. If it wasn't for the music, this game would be almost perfect. Paul was less convinced, asking, is there suddenly a shortage of Tetris in the world? That said, Todd did try to push back a little bit, explaining that the color makes all the difference. Yes, it's true that this is a little more than the Game Boy Tetris in color, but I say that the added modes and the quality of life changes make this the one to play. That said, with an average of 90%, Tetris DX actually scores slightly lower than the Game Boy original, which earned a 91%. On the other hand, it averaged a much higher score than the 78% the Nintendo Entertainment System version earned. No matter, because now you have a bunch of great ways to play Tetris, which is definitely a good thing in my books.
Hey kid, where's my lunch money?
You haven't been flossing. You haven't been flossing.
Get a job.
Escape to a world of color. For each and every Game Boy game, new Game Boy Color.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these Tetris reviews. I know that some of this is a little redundant since we already did the Tetris episode last week, but this is actually the second time Nintendo announced a game ahead of time and then just added more to the upload. In fact, they did the exact same thing almost exactly 1 year ago with Jet Force Gemini. They initially announced that it was going to be a standalone release, only to then upload it 2 weeks later with 1080 Snowboarding and Harvest Moon 64. Weird that it's always around this time of the year, huh? Anyway, there's a playlist and you should check it out and blah blah blah. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's the best version of Tetris? There are just so many different versions to choose from. I'm excited to see which one you pick in the comments below. In other news, a lot of the reviews and features that I'd been working on for this week, well, they got a little delayed because I ended up injuring my elbow last week and I could barely move my arm. Today's actually the first day where things kind of feel back to normal, give or take a little pain here and there. The whole thing really should be cleared up shortly, and then we're just gonna tear through a bunch of reviews. I also have a fun review crew special lined up for Christmas Day. I think you're gonna love it. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,